I'm Connor Old, and welcome back to another episode of Old's Oscar Countdown. And this week, we're going to be looking at 5 categories that are guaranteed locks that will win the award at the Oscars. This is a bit of a sister video to last week's episode where I talked about 5 categories that I was worried about, that I'm unsure who's going to win. But I think it's just as important to understand categories that are guaranteed to lock, so as to not ruin your Oscar predictions by predicting something that you try to be a little bit too cute with and try to go with the number 2 movie. There's certain categories where it makes sense to make smart, calculated risks, but sometimes it's also helpful to know which categories are locks. Don't worry about them. Pick this movie and worry about your time and energy in trying to predict the other categories. That's how you get an accurate Oscar predictions year over year, like I have been throughout this channel, now on our 8th season. But you guys have been showing a lot of support for these videos, and I appreciate that, and I ask you to continue to show support for those videos. Comment below. Let me know your thoughts. Let me know 5 categories that you're confident in. Let me know if you're worried about any of my 5 categories. I tried to be a little bit more bold this year in picking categories that not necessarily everybody thinks are locks, but I think are, including some of the more bigger categories instead of just, some obvious technical ones, but that should be, still fun to talk about regardless. So without further ado, jumping into the first category that I think is a lock this year, and that's Best Supporting Actress, with the winner being Da'Vine Joy Randolph for The Holdovers. Now, is this the most obvious lock of all of the categories? No, not necessarily, but I wanted to include one of the big 4 acting categories in this prediction slot, because, well, we never know for sure the acting categories. We've seen lots of surprises in many years, but I think actually both supporting actor categories are pretty locked up, with Robert Downey Jr. most likely winning for Best Supporting Actor, but this one being even more of a lock. And I went with Randolph here because all roads lead to her as the likely winner. You could either take a historical stat-based argument, or you can take a narrative-based argument. I'm more dubious of the narrative-based arguments because they haven't been as successful in recent years, but it doesn't matter which side you take. All roads lead back to her. Everyone agrees that she's most likely the winner, no matter which way you slice it, because the historical stat-based arguments, you have things like the fact that she's been winning and nominated more than any of her other nominees that she's nominated with in terms of industry awards, so things like SAG, indicative award shows like Critics' Choice, some of the more bigger ones, but then also smaller critics groups like Boston Critics Society. So she's been getting the support, she has the stats to back her up. But then also, if you want to give a narrative argument, the fact that she's in a Best Picture movie, where this is the most likely chance of this movie winning any award, aside from maybe original screenplay. So if people really like The Holdovers, they're going to want to give the movie some sort of support. Makes sense to give the support here in this category and then diversify their support in other ways. So the conclusions are always leading back to her. And then you look at some of her competition and you go, well, she doesn't really have a lot of competition. The number 2, I think, in terms of a win would actually be someone like Emily Blunt, who could maybe pull off a Jamie Lee Curtis last year, where she rides the wave of the support of Oppenheimer. But let's not forget that the frontrunner at this time last year was Angela Bassett, and she was in Black Panther: Wakanda Forever, which was not a Best Picture movie. It only had a couple other nominations, so it wasn't a well-beloved movie in the same way Da'Vine Joy Randolph is in The Holdovers, a Best Picture nominee, a strong Best Picture nominee at that as well. So I don't really see an Emily Blunt surprise, but I guess she could follow a path as someone like a Jamie Lee Curtis. Then the other competition, Danielle Brooks, The Color Purple. She's the only nominee from that movie. Jodie Foster for Nyad. Jodie Foster's won twice already, so I don't think that's going to happen. Nyad's not a Best Picture movie. And then America Ferrera in Barbie. That was the big surprise nomination on Oscar nominations morning. And because she doesn't have any sort of nominations elsewhere, she wasn't nominated at SAG, wasn't nominated at BAFTA, it'd be a real shock if she won on Oscar morning. And I think it would be a little silly to predict it just because she's going to win nothing because she's been nominated at any of the precursor awards. So it'd be a really shock and a surprise if she were to win at the Oscars. And I would be bold enough to predict that because she's got really nothing going for her right now. It does seem like she was kind of that 5th slot surprise that snuck in there rather than a real strong contender. So whether you want to do a historical stat-based argument or whether you want to look at the narrative of why she should win, all roads lead back to Da'Vine Joy Randolph for The Holdovers. Then the second category that I'm most sure about is Christopher Nolan for Oppenheimer. And usually the Best Director category is pretty preordained. Early on in the season, we usually have a pretty good idea of who's going to win for Best Director. Even when their movies don't necessarily win Best Picture, the director is pretty locked up. In recent years, Jane Campion won for director, Alfonso Cuarón won for director, Damien Chazelle won for director. And all of the movies, Power of the Dog, Roma, La La Land, they were all frontrunners to win Best Picture and ended up surprisingly not winning for Best Picture, and yet still the director won. So even if you have some off chance that maybe The Holdovers or Barbie surprises and wins Best Picture, I'd be very surprised if Christopher Nolan doesn't win for Best Director. And when I look at this movie, I can't help but see the parallels, at least in terms of the Oscars, with Schindler's List. If you remember 1993, 30 years ago exactly, to 2023 when Oppenheimer was released, Steven Spielberg made a movie, Schindler's List, a 3-hour black and white historical drama that made a lot of money at the box office, got Spielberg his first director prize, and also won for Best Picture. It was sort of the big crowning achievement for Spielberg, who was a blockbuster director who had been nominated before, but had been sort of chasing the Oscar and never got it. And then you look at Christopher Nolan, well-respected household name, just like Spielberg was in the 80s and 90s, who has been nominated before but has never won, who's made blockbusters, the Batman movies, Inception, and now finally makes a 3-hour black and white historical drama and will most likely win Best Director for it. The parallels are a little bit too obvious. I really do see the parallels there. And in the same way people sort of finally respected Spielberg for his Schindler's List movie, I think people will respect Nolan for this movie because it's finally so obvious that Christopher Nolan is the clear, most notable brand name director in Hollywood, maybe the best director movie working today with a great sort of history and track record of great movie after great movie. It's just in terms of how the cast talks about him, how people clearly respect him within Hollywood. People continuously refer to him as a genius. Some of his award speeches so far have actually been some of my favorite of the season, so he's been nailing that element too. And he's the director of the Best Picture Frontrunner, and it's a movie that is very directed in terms of support on the acting side, but also support on the technical side. He was finally able, I think, to merge those two, or he was always seen as more of a technical director, but now he's finally able to get maybe Oscar-winning performances out of Cillian Murphy and Robert Downey Jr. This is the big bad movie to beat so far of this Oscar season, and Nolan seems like he's going to steamroll his way, at the very least, to a Best Director win. Then the third category I'm sure about winning is the Best International Feature category, which will go to The Zone of Interest. And this one has very simple explanation, so we'll keep it pretty short. And that is, The Zone of Interest is the only movie of the movies nominated for Best International Feature that is also nominated for Best Picture. So if there's another international film that was more well-liked than The Zone of Interest, shouldn't that also be nominated for Best Picture? But of course, a movie like Society of the Snow won't win this category because it wasn't nominated for Best Picture. Therefore, we should have an obvious understanding that because The Zone of Interest was nominated for Best Picture, and it was the only international film of the 5 that were nominated to get nominated for Best Picture, therefore it should win Best International Feature Film. And yet, every year, there are still people that try to get cute with this category. I see it time and time again, because they go, Connor, what about Amelie? What about Pan's Labyrinth? Those were movies that had a bunch of nominations that didn't win Best International Feature and lost to lesser movies. And yes, that's true, that did happen 20 years ago. Let's look at the last 5 years, just the last 5 years, recent Oscar history of people actually still voting today. Parasite, Roma, Drive My Car, All Quiet on the Western Front. All movies that were nominated for Best Picture and also nominated in Best International Feature that won this award. So let's not look at 20 years history, let's look at recent history, where if you're nominated for Best Picture and you're the only movie in your international feature lineup that's nominated for Best Picture, obviously you're going to win for Best International Feature Film. We can make calculated risks, but sometimes we have to take the obvious picks, and this is an obvious pick. Don't overthink it, just predict the zone of interest here. Then the fourth category I'm not really concerned about is the Best Score category, with the winner, I think, going to Oppenheimer. Why? Well, it's won everywhere. It won at Golden Globes, it won at Critics' Choice, it's won at some smaller groups like the Composer and Songwriters Guild. It's the likely Best Picture winner. It's from a past winner, which this branch they love to nominate John Williams every year, or Thomas Newman a bunch of times. Ludwig Göransson has already won before, so I think they'll appreciate that. And then also the score is wall to wall. When you think about this movie, you think about the score because it never stops. It is almost throughout the entire movie. And for a lot of these technical categories, it's important to remember that everyone in the Oscars votes on them. While the certain branch of the Academy votes on the nominees, everyone on the Oscars votes on every category. So oftentimes it helps in these technical categories just to look at what the most is. What's the most costumes? Which film has the most editing? That will win editing. So in many ways, you look at the score category and you go, what has the most score? And that's obviously Oppenheimer. It has these catchy leitmotifs that are constantly repeated and stick in your head and are very tied and in sync with the movie, a movie which, by the way, is very well liked. And I put this category in here because I think some people try to let their personal opinions seep into the Oscars, which is okay. You know, at the end of the day, we want to have fun. But when trying to predict the Oscars, it helps to remove your personal opinion. So sometimes people won't predict a movie like Oppenheimer, maybe because they don't like the score, because they listen to it on Spotify and it doesn't really, connect with them. And they really got a strong, passionate connection to a movie like American Fiction and its score. So they'll make a dumb prediction and predict that movie to win for score. Sometimes when you're predicting the Oscars, it helps to try to be as objective as possible. And even though you may not like a certain costume design or a certain editing choice or a certain score, sometimes you're in the minority, and a lot of people, particularly within the Academy, do appreciate that. That's why I try to help you with on this channel. Even though you may not like the Oppenheimer score, sometimes it makes sense to look at it objectively and go, it's won everywhere, it's from a Best Picture nominee, it's from a past winner, it's got the most score, it's recognizable, yada yada yada. Therefore, it's going to win in this category, and I'm pretty confident that best score will go to Ludwig Göransson for Oppenheimer. And then in the fifth category that I'm sure about is the best editing category, which I think is going to go to Oppenheimer. And this was a category I wanted to include here because I could have gone with a category like cinematography, which I think is maybe even more of a lock than this category. But I do think that the editing category, some people may overthink it, and I want to reassure people why I think it's most likely going to be Oppenheimer. Yes, a movie like Anatomy of a Fall could win, and it's been showing a lot of support, and it's been sort of building in its support, so maybe it surprises in editing, and then wins screenplay, and then who knows, maybe it wins picture. We're not really at that point right now, and everything else leans us to Oppenheimer. Of course, Oppenheimer, at least right now, I think is the frontrunner to win for Best Picture. It's also a movie with a lot of editing. Like I mentioned with Best Score, sometimes it helps to be the most of something, and the sort of dueling narratives that it has, particularly, in this black and white versus the color, lots of editing, lots of intercutting, which Nolan is well known for, which is why he won for a movie like Dunkirk. And if you look at the past 5 winners, there is an average runtime of 2 hours and 20 minutes. And Oppenheimer, aside from Killers of the Flower Moon, is the longest movie nominated this year. And the editing category, like I mentioned, the winner usually has an average runtime of 2 hours and 20 minutes. The editing category, they just like movies that are long, that there is a lot of editing, because you have to take this grand story like Killers of the Flower Moon and condense it to something like 3.5 hours. There's an appreciation for that, I think, within lots of members of the Academy. And Oppenheimer fits that bill because it's long, because there is a lot of editing. So that helps. It's the likely best picture winner. So that helps as well. But then also, there's a strong connection between this category and the best sound category. If you take out last year, it was 15 years in a row in which the best editing winner was also nominated for best sound. As a matter of fact, if you take out last year, the best editing winner also won sound 12 out of those last 15 years. So 15 years in a row, the best editing winner was nominated for sound. And 12 of those 15, the editing winner also won a sound award. So people really do correlate these two categories together in many ways. So if you're predicting a movie like Anatomy of a Fall for best editing, you have to realize you're really taking an outside's chance, because it was not nominated for best sound, and people often like to correlate best sound and best editing. That is a real stat. Now, it didn't happen last year, which I was wrong about. I thought Top Gun Maverick would surprise, and that was because Everything Everywhere All at Once was this really beloved movie and won Best Picture and Director and all these acting awards and really swept the Oscars. It really connected with the Academy in particular, which is why I think it overperformed in a category like Best Editing. But that's not the case this year. Anatomy of a Fall, I don't think, is the Best Picture winner. Even if it is a Best Picture winner, it's not going to win more than 5 Oscars, I think, like Everything Everywhere All at Once, to sweep in a category like this. I still think Oppenheimer, which is the frontrunner to win for Best Picture and something like Best Director, should be the frontrunner to win in Best Editing. Is it as much of a lock as some other categories? No, I acknowledge that, but I do think some people will maybe overthink this category or worry about this category. Right now, all signs point to editing. Jennifer Lame, well-respected editor as well, who's worked on lots of Best Picture nominees, so there's respect there. Still, Oppenheimer is the flashier movie with a longer runtime than something like Anatomy of a Fall, and I think a stronger chance to win Best Picture. But that's about it, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video. Make sure you comment below. Let me know your thoughts on some categories that you maybe think are a lock, or some categories that you think you disagree with me with and actually aren't a lock and you're predicting something else. I'd love to hear that stuff in the comments down below. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss next week's video. But that's about it. Until next time, stay tuned.